So today I want to talk about my series about navigating disability within public education from a parent's perspective. And today I'm going to talk about IEPs versus ISPs. Now, I have done several other videos in this series, especially where I talk about in depth what an IEP is. So I would suggest going back and watching those videos if you haven't already and you don't know what an IEP is, because I'm going to very, very high level talk about an IEP, but I go into way more detail in previous videos. So let's talk about what the technical differences are between an IEP and an ISP. So an IEP is an individualized education plan, which falls under federal law under the Individuals with Disabilities Act, IDEA. Now, this is something that is provided for every public school student who qualifies under one of the 13 disabilities from IDEA. An IEP outlines any special education supports and services that the school is going to provide to the student, along with any curriculum changes that need to be made and any modifications that need to be made. Anything that really deviates from the standard general education process is going to be included in that, and those things include any specially designed instructions, any services and details about those services, any accommodation changes. So, for example, that would be anything change about the learning environment. So where the child takes a test, how much time they have to take a test, if they need to leave the classroom to take breaks, a sensory corner, things like that. Any modifications, so changes to what the student needs to learn or know. So maybe doing fewer math problems, or reading at a different reading level, or taking maybe a different kind of test than their peers when they're being tested on things. Any assistive technology that the school is going to provide and how it will be used, how the student will be included in general education with their peers, and explanations for why not if they won't be. And then also includes annual goals with the need for data collection and how to track those goals, which also includes their current level of performance and, again, how the data will be collected. So like I said, the student must meet the requirements for one of the 13 disabilities that is outlined in IDEA, which I've outlined and talked about in depth in a different video. And the disability must have a major impact on how the student goes through school, and the student also must need specialized instruction. This isn't just academic, it's also social and emotional. Now, what's an ISP? I'm going to go a little bit more into depth in that because I haven't talked about that before. So an ISP is an individualized service plan, or just a service plan depending on where you live. They call it different things. It is an individualized plan that is offered by the local education agency, which is the LEA. And the LEA differs, depending on where you live. It could be the county you live in, it could be the region, it could be the state. What's offered to any child that goes to a private school. So under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the LEA was required to set aside funds to provide services to students who attend private schools. An ISP is only going to include services that will be made available for the child. So you're not going to have goals in there, you're not going to have accommodations, you're not going to have modifications, it's just going to be services. And so they're not going to get the same services that they would in public school. Instead, they're entitled to what is called equitable services, which is based on the funding that the LEA puts aside every year. The services provided will either be provided at the private school if possible, but the student might also have to travel to a public school to receive those services instead. Service decisions and funding are based on year-to-year decisions, and so one year there could be funding and one year there might not be funding. One year there might be less funding and the next year there could be more funding. It really depends. And if the funding runs out before the school year ends, then services stop until the next school year. So it's very limited in what's available, and it's just not going to provide the same things that an IEP would. To qualify for an ISP, the student must be placed in a private school by their parent or guardian. They need to qualify for one of the 13 disabilities listed in IDEA, and then they need special education to benefit from and access general education. So how would you know if your child needs an ISP? Well, there's the obvious one where you had an IEP and you moved from a public school to a private school, and you would work with the county on moving from an IEP to an ISP. Well, what if your child's in a private school and you feel like they need special education services, but they don't currently have them? You can then go to the county or even the school that you are attending and ask for help for connecting with the county and have your child evaluated through Child Find, and then they will determine whether or not your child qualifies for services through an ISP. So no matter what, no matter where you live, no matter what school your kid goes to, they are eligible for special education services. It's just going to differ whether they're in public school or private school. So that's really the big main difference is IEP is for public school, ISP is for private school. The other really big main difference is an IEP is going to cover services, accommodations, modifications, anything that deviates from the general education process. An ISP is only going to provide services, and the services are limited and subject to funding. Whereas in an IEP, the services are not subject to funding. It doesn't matter what the funding is, they have to provide those services. Now let's talk about a real world example of this, because that's just like, okay, so what? So we actually had an experience of going between an IEP and an ISP and then back to an IEP. So we moved from Virginia, and in Virginia, my daughter was evaluated by the county that we lived in at 2.5 years old and was deemed eligible for an IEP because she qualified under the autism disability under IDEA. In Virginia, she went to a special education preschool within the county. She took a bus there, she had an IEP, everything was set up. We then moved to Tennessee. Her IEP moved with us because that is how IEPs work. They are under federal law, and so they move from state to state with you, so don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise. When we moved to Tennessee, we moved to a place where she could attend a school that was actually a private school, but this private school had a contract with the county to provide seats for children that needed to attend a special education preschool. And schools do this all the time, counties do this all the time, because if they, for example, don't have enough classrooms, don't have enough teachers, just don't have the ability to provide the services for these students, they will contract out to other schools that can provide those services. So she went to this preschool and she was placed through the county. So she was technically at a private preschool, but was attending as a public school student. Hopefully that makes sense. Because of that, she had her IEP. And at the end of her first school year, so in 2021, the plan was for her to continue attending that school for her second year of preschool. So her second year of preschool there. And we had her IEP meeting to create her IEP for the 2021-2022 school year in June. Well, between the middle of June when we had that meeting and the middle of July, the school and the county terminated their contract. And so she went from attending a private school as a county student to just attending a private school. So we had two options. We could keep the IEP that she currently had and just move her to a different public school where she would attend special education preschool, or we could keep her at the private preschool that she was at and switch over to an ISP. We decided to keep her at the preschool that she was at because this was a really special school and a big reason why we moved to Tennessee. It was a fully inclusive preschool, so it was about 50-50 kids with disabilities, kids without disabilities. And then this preschool was also attached to a developmental pediatrician's office. And this office actually worked and had a bunch of other therapy services. So they had OT, speech, feeding, ABA. And that team, if your child attended that medical practice, and the preschool team would all meet together every other week and decide what was going on and what was needed for the child. So students were able to receive services through insurance in the same building. So while the county and the preschool had their contract together, any child that received any other kind of services had to be done outside of the classroom because of equity reasons. But once they went their separate ways, all therapies could happen in the classroom. So when we were looking at what our options were, we decided that it was best to keep her in this private preschool because she could now have all of her therapies in the classroom. So she had play therapy and feeding therapy in the classroom. She had OT and speech that, depending on what they were doing, they worked in the classroom or outside of the classroom. And this was a big deal for our daughter because for an entire school year, she had a one-on-one therapist, basically having an aide in a public school, but trained as the therapist, in her preschool classroom with her for the majority of the day, and then tapered down to only a few hours in the morning, with her in her classroom, helping her navigate working with peers, academics, helping her learn how to self-regulate, being in situations with her in the moment to be able to go, okay, this is what we do when this happens. Or when this happens, you clearly need a break, so we need to go for a walk. Or I'm, like, as the therapist, watching this child start to melt down, start to shut down, we need to leave, we need to remove her. That was never, ever, ever going to happen in a public school, even with the amazing IEP that she had. So we chose to keep her in the private school, and while her ISP was drastically different from our IEP, and I'll talk about that in a second, she was receiving services in the private school that she never would have received in a public school, even with that IEP. And we actually credit all of that, like those services and all of that stuff that she received, for her being able to start kindergarten at the age of 5 with her peers. Still with a lot of accommodations and with an IEP, but she was able to do that. So let's talk about the differences between the IEP and the ISP. So again, like I said, she had an IEP that was created for the 2021-2022 school year in June of 2021. Like, that was for that school year. A month later, the ISP was made. So these were for the exact same school year. So it's a really interesting comparison, which most people don't get to see. So let's talk about the IEP first. The IEP gave her 2,100 minutes of special education and related services per week with 10 annual goals. That's a lot. To break that down just a little bit, it's like almost 7 hours a day of the special education preschool program. So that takes a lot of that out. And then she had 30 minutes a week for speech and 30 minutes every 2 weeks for OT. So a lot of that 2,100 minutes was being in the classroom, but they still counted that because it was a specialized special education program. In contrast, her ISP had 30 minutes per week of speech therapy with 1 annual goal. That was it. That's all the county was able to provide. That's all she qualified for. This is for the exact same school year. Like I said, as parents, we made the decision to keep her in the private school where she was going to receive all these services and have this incredibly enriching school year and experience that she would not have gotten with her IEP in a different school. When she graduated from that preschool in 2022, she then started kindergarten in the 2022-2023 school year, and we switched back to an IEP. She had a lot less service hours or service minutes per week, and that was because she was no longer in a specialized program. It was only 280 minutes per week because she was in a mainstream kindergarten class. So that's a big difference, but again, that explains that. Like I said, there's a big difference between an IEP and an ISP. Same school year, same kid. It was actually even for the same school, because initially the IEP was still going to be at the school that she was attending and kept attending. So it's just a really interesting contrast between the two things. Any parent who has a child that has a disability and has to have these kinds of services knows that there are different things that you have to consider when making these decisions. And obviously, understanding what you're going to get out of the county, really, makes a big difference. If you're going to be attending a private school that offers incredible services and you're only getting a little bit from the county, it's fine. It's my opinion anyway. And then if you're going to a really amazing county school and you still have services, that's great too. So hopefully this helped explain the difference between an IEP and an ISP, because I think that's important, and understanding, what your options are, because you don't know what your options are if you don't even know what the options are. You don't know what you don't know. So if you liked this video and you want to see more like this, please like and subscribe so that you'll see more in your feed. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.